Do it, the will should be the whole of the law. Welcome everybody to the final 8th session of the second course on Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. And if people could just indicate that they can hear me okay. Dan or Luke, are you able to hear my audio okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. All right, that should be all right. So we're going to be talking about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn today, and particularly in relationship to all of the movements that we've been looking at in the past 2 courses. And my thesis for today is that what's important about the Golden Dawn, above and beyond the fact that they're the major conduit feeding into the Thelemic movement, is that they're this amazing synthesis of all, as on a practical level, of all the stuff that's gone before. And when I say practical, I mean that this is a system that you can actually practice and not just be like a disciple where somebody else is the master and you've got to obey them and they tell you what the teaching is, and then you're just sort of piously impressed as to how wonderful the teaching is. That the Golden Dawn system is a practical system of magic and mysticism whereby one can oneself cultivate the faculty of vision and of access to these noetic realms of experience and of mystical attainment. And so you can be your own adept. You don't have to rely on third parties, although of course there could be other people who act as mentor or teacher figures. And of course, this is the ideal that is upheld in Aleister Crowley's own teaching system, the AA, and its related traditions. So I want to ask, though, or begin with a kind of query or question about the Golden Dawn, because if we remember, the last class was on the Theosophical Society, and one of the things we were looking at was the way that the myth of the ascended masters, the Mahatmas, and the Golden Dawn has its own equivalent to that, of what are called the secret chiefs, which are allegedly the source of the order's teaching, that the heads of the order, Mathers and Westcott in particular, are supposedly in communication with. And it turns out that in the context of the Theosophical Society, that for Blavatsky, the hidden masters or ascended Mahatmas were kind of a cover story for both her own teaching activity and also the promulgation of the teachings and agendas of any number of actual spiritually proficient teachers and masters, if you will, that she had encountered in her own travels. And she had built up a kind of network of people that she was acting in a way on the behalf of, but mostly for political reasons. She didn't want to directly announce the identity of these people because many of them were involved in the Indian independence movement and were basically anti-imperialist revolutionaries. And so their political activity needed to remain under the radar. And so Blavatsky's own anti-colonial subversive activities are also something that this narrative is meant to also be kind of a cover story for. But then what happens is that the narrative kind of takes off and develops its own momentum. And then Blavatsky winds up in a way kind of getting trapped in her own myth of origins that she's created in order to promulgate what she intends to be a set of spiritual teachings, which she does want to be taken seriously and that she means seriously, but then wind up being on a popular level perhaps discredited because of their association with this myth that gets called out at a certain point. And so my question in beginning this class is whether or not the myth of origins of the Golden Dawn related to the secret chiefs whether or not this functions, and my answer is yes, it does function as a cover story for some actual analog in reality, which is the actual source of the teachings, as it were, of the Golden Dawn, but are being, that actual historical lineage is in a sense being suppressed or concealed to allow the leadership of the Golden Dawn to kind of promote what they're doing as being more original than it actually is. And I would propose that the figure of Anna Sprengel, who is the German adept that Westcott in particular is supposedly in correspondence with, who gives the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn its charter. And then she basically, Anna Sprengel, vanishes and says, well, the other adepts here in Germany never really approved of me giving you a charter, so you're on your own and I'm not going to communicate with you anymore. And that ends the correspondence. And then that gets picked up later by Mathers after Westcott has basically been pushed out politically of his leadership role. And Mathers is then the sole acting chief of the order. And then he's claiming that he's now in telepathic communication, either noetically, or he would use this kind of, he had this this pendant that he would, and this circle with letters on it, and he would use this pendulum allegedly to communicate with the secret chiefs, or maybe Moina, his wife, would be a medium, or he would be the medium. But anyway, he's claiming to still be in communication with these chiefs. And my proposal is that just as the different Mahatmas for Blavatsky are correspond or correlate to certain specific quote unquote real life adepts that she was in communication with, that she was learning esotericism from, and was also involved in the Indian underground Indian independence movement, was also involved with these figures as well. That Anna Sprengel is also a kind of covering figure for another actually real person. And I would propose that Anna Sprengel is a cover for Anna Kingsford, note the similarity in names, who is the head of the Hermetic Society that the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden, note the similarity in names, were members of at the time that they were founding their own order. And that she is in fact the primary magical or spiritual teacher of the two main founders of the order, particularly Mathers, and that she's the source of many of the sort of discernments or choices that the leadership of the Golden Dawn were making in terms of how they were going to relate to the earlier Western esoteric tradition. That most of these doctrines are already worked out ahead of time by Anna Kingsford, aka Anna Sprengel. So let me say a little bit about her, because she's one of the, I mentioned her already in this class, but she's one of the forgotten figures of the Victorian occult revival of what Jocelyn Godwin calls the Theosophical Enlightenment. Her dates are 1846 to 1888. She's very much the type of the new woman, so-called, in late Victorian society. That is to say that she's an independent woman and is educated and active in politics and society. She was a political radical. She was part of what we could call free thought, and her particular issues were feminism, especially women's suffrage, and also vegetarianism. And she was also an animal rights activist. This was called anti-vivisection at the time, is the name for this. We would now call this animal rights activism. And she also earned an MD, a medical degree, in Paris in 1880. She wasn't allowed to study medicine in England, but things were slightly more emancipated in France. And so she was able to get a medical degree there, which she achieved in 1880. one of the few women at the time. There's a few others, but who was able to get a degree in the medical profession. Basically, this is a way for her to get a degree in the sciences. And in 1873, she met a gentleman by the name of Edward Maitland. His dates are 1827 to 1897. And they were spiritual partners. And this is similar to the relationship between Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, who are also partners. And just like that relationship, Olcott is kind of the ultimately the student of Blavatsky. And in a similar way, Maitland is ultimately the student of and supporter of the work of Anna Kingsford, but he's her partner. They weren't married and were celibate. They didn't have a romantic relationship, but they were spiritual partners. Anna Kingsford was actually herself married, but was largely estranged from her husband and pursued her own independent activity. Both started out as being spiritualists. Many people involved in the occult scene were, but they gradually built up their own spiritual system. This was primarily inspired by Emanuel Swedenborg's theory of correspondences. More on that in a moment. And also Hermetic magic, largely through the writings of Eliphas Levi. And like the founders of the Golden Dawn, Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland are perhaps best described, if we wanted to say what's their religion or their the basis of their religious beliefs, they're probably best described as being post-Christian rather than neo-pagan. Neo-pagan is really more a later category that emerges in the 20th century, although I do think that Aleister Crowley can definitely be considered to be in that category and is one of the major progenitors of it. But neo-paganism is a category that maybe overlaps with, but doesn't maybe best describe the mode of spirituality that's going on in occult circles in late Victorian society. I think the term post-Christian is better descriptive. So basically, these are people who all have a usually, but not always, Protestant Christian background, and they're now looking to, through involvement in free thought or other types of radical or alternative discourse, to rethink the categories of their original religious belief. And in doing that, they typically abandon what would be considered any kind of orthodox Christian criteria for belief. So if Orthodox Christianity, you could say that the criterion for being a Christian could be belief in the atonement, for example. So you're supposed to have faith in Jesus Christ's status as being the Messiah. This is St. Paul's argument. And therefore, that's supposed to, you're going to be then saved through faith, through what's called pistis, is the Greek word that Paul uses for faith. Well, there's an alternative form of Christianity that's hybridized with Judaism and other types of Egyptian theurgic spiritual practice in late antiquity. It's called Gnosticism. And sometimes that can involve belief in the figure of Jesus Christ as a kind of great magical adept, perhaps in company with other magical adepts like Hermes Trismegistus or whomever, Simon Magus, whoever you're looking to for inspiration. But the criterion for salvation is not the same as Pauline Nicene Orthodox Christianity, meaning that pistis or faith is not really the criterion. Instead, it's another kind of mystical or magical understanding that's called gnosis. And that can take different forms in these different traditions. The type of post-Christian occultism that we're looking at today, and that characterizes the milieu of all of these different figures, including a lot of the membership of the Theosophical Society as well, could be described as Gnostic in that sense. So it's a kind of post-Christian Gnosticism where people are looking beyond the traditional boundaries of Christian cultural identity and are re-engaging with all of these esoteric currents of earlier thought that all of the stuff basically that we've been looking at in the earlier classes in these courses. So for the Hermetic Society, founded by Kingsford, in company with a lot of theosophists and also the founders of the Golden Dawn, Jewish Kabbalah, Egyptian Hermeticism, and a kind of Platonic theurgic paganism are all viewed as equivalently valid doctrines and sources of spiritual inspiration. So all of these elements get woven together. And of course, the initiatory system of the Golden Dawn is similar. It also has this quality, weaving together particularly Greek theurgy and Jewish Kabbalah. But there's also this overlay of certain theosophical categories. And of course, the order as a whole is characterized as being Hermetic. Okay, so in 1882, Kingsford publishes her main work based on her own visions that she's been having and has been interpreting and has created her own spiritual system on that basis. And this book, published in 1882, is called The Perfect Way, or The Finding of Christ. And the Christ in the title is not really the historical Jesus. It's rather the cosmic Christ that's being set forth as the exemplar of the adepts in, say, the Rosicrucian manifestos. Remember that in the manifestos, there's the opening up of the tomb of Christian Rosenkreuz, and his uncorrupted body is found inside of the tomb that's been miraculously preserved due to his spiritual purity. And of course, Christian Rosenkreuz is a type of Christ, and he's a type, specifically what we might call the cosmic Christ, or the initiate Christ, the great adept, or the great magician or mystic. And so he serves as an exemplar of that, but the atonement is rejected in favor of the soul's development through reincarnation in the perfect way. And the idea here is that what's called Christ is really the divine genius that is also called Adonai in the text. And you're supposed to practice mysticism and get in communication with what's basically your own higher and divine principle of your soul, basically what's called the neshama in Kabbalah. And by getting in communication with this, you yourself become the Christ. You yourself become the holy adept. And then this is the goal of Gnostic mystical practice. This is the perfect way, the way to the finding of Christ, meaning of the attainment of the higher divine genius. And of course, this is clearly the source of the similar magical doctrine that's taught in the second order of the Golden Dawn. And then MacGregor Mathers further associates this with the teaching that's in the to invoke the holy guardian angel that's in the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin. And then, of course, this all is then transferred over to Thelemic magic, where the goal is to attain the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, who's also the higher and divine self, or the divine genius, who's also called Adonai in the holy books, most notably Liber 65, the Book of the Heart Girt with the Serpent. And all of this has its kind of the immediate predecessor of this, where these ideas are all already kind of combined into one package, is the esoteric or Rosicrucian Christianity that's presented in this text, the The Perfect Way or The Finding of Christ by Anna Kingsford. So she's kind of the adept that precedes the adepts of the Golden Dawn that then precedes our own tradition. So that's why she's, again, I say she's kind of the forgotten adept. She's kind of this important connecting link in our own lineage that isn't so much remembered or talked about. Other people get more attention from her. The other thing that's important about The Perfect Way is that Anna Kingsford's personal visions and her interpretation of scripture, they're interpreted symbolically rather than literally. So she might have some particular visionary experience, but it's all interpreted not as a literal view into ultimate reality, but it gives you an understanding through the interpretation of the symbolism that appears in the ritual, in the vision. And what's important about this is that, first of all, it derives from Emanuel Swedenborg's concept of correspondences. And this is basically the basis for the Golden Dawn's approach to visionary experience on the astral plane. And it's distinct from the way that the astral plane was understood in and experienced by adepts within the Theosophical tradition. And this is actually kind of an important distinction. So I want to spend a moment explaining what I mean by this. So in the later Theosophical society, as it develops, their understanding of occult science becomes very positivistic, very literal. It's meant to directly replace and compete with the physical sciences. And so to give an example of this, Charles Webster Leadbetter and Annie Besant were the leaders of the society after Olcott passed away as the president. Annie Besant becomes the president of the Theosophical Society. Her and Leadbetter did a book on occult chemistry. And what they did is that they would sit in Annie Besant's drawing room, and they would astrally project themselves to the British Museum. And they would, where there were samples of different elements in the periodic table or whatever that were on display there in like the natural science section. And they would astrally investigate from a distance the occult atomic structure of which of course is different from the atomic structure that's alleged to be the case in the actual physical natural sciences. And so they published this whole book that's rather preposterous, to be frank, about the occult chemistry of all the etheric patterns or whatever related to all the different physical elements that was based on this. This was supposed to just be literally the case. This was supposed to actually be, this was meant to be a contribution to science. And by the Second World War, the Theosophical Society's version of occult science had largely been discredited as a result of that, because there'd been significant advances in physics, particularly with relativity and quantum mechanics, and basically it just continued to disprove all of the claims that were being made by the occultists during the same period. Now, what's interesting about the Golden Dawn and Thelema's approach, in contrast to, you could say, occult gnosis or occult knowledge, is that it's metaphorical rather than literal. It's existential rather than, you could say, physicalist. What that means is that in the Swedenborgian tradition, as well as in the Hermetic Society, as well as in the Golden Dawn, as well as in Thelema, this other thread that comes from Swedenborg, when you have a vision, remember Swedenborg said that heaven looks different for everybody because it's a reflection of your inner state, because your mind is the soul is always already in heaven, because the condition of the soul is heaven, because human beings are angels that are in heaven. It's just that we take on having a physical body, and then when we die, then we're back in heaven. But when we're in our imagination, when we're experiencing dreams or visions, we're in heaven. And it looks different for everybody because it's a reflection of our inner state, but through symbolic correspondences, we're able to interpret what that means in terms of higher spiritual truth. So the vision that we have doesn't have to be literally true to be able to extract its existential significance, if we will, its meaning in terms of our own true will or our own unique truth, our own spiritual truth of self, which is the goal of course, of Thelemic magical practice, to try to use magic to discover. So, so then what's important about that is that it's not in competition with the physical sciences. It's its own, it operates with its own domain of signification. And so it doesn't have to compete with actual science. And in fact, Crowley's all in favor of the normal physical sciences. He's a Darwinian. He studied chemistry, actual chemistry, not occult chemistry. He was fluent in the scientific writings that were coming out in the new science that was happening around Einstein and the other collaborators in that. And so this particular alternative symbolic trajectory means that we don't, as practitioners, we don't have to be in competition or trying to refute the physical sciences. And the Theosophical tradition kind of boxed itself into a corner by trying to do that. It was trying to compete directly with the physical sciences, and it lost, basically. And so that's an important difference, particularly, and you could say that the epistemology, the theory of knowledge that's associated with the technique of astral projection, for example, so that a theosophist, as opposed to a Golden Dawn trained magician, would have a different procedure when they're astrally projecting themselves and having visions in terms of how they interpret that. And that is an important concept that comes into the Golden Dawn and then into Thelema, that derives from Anna Kingsford. Now, the perfect way, the way that's being offered in her work, is more of an ethical system than a practical magical system. And so this was still something that needed to be developed. And again, that's the particular contribution of the Golden Dawn, which is to have a firmly practical system of magic and mysticism. In 1883 to 84, Anna Kingsford was president of the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which was founded in that time. And then, but she resigned a year later amidst significant conflict between her and Blavatsky, because they had different agendas in terms of what direction they wanted to move the Theosophical Society and its teachings. This was at a time when Blavatsky was based in India, and she was increasingly moving the teaching of the Theosophical Society in a Buddhist and Vedantic direction, and introducing a lot of Hindu terminology, Sanskrit categories, and so forth. And there was some resistance to that in some of the Western membership of the order. Hence the breaking away of Anna Kingsford in 1884 from the Theosophical Society, and in 1885 she founded the Hermetic Society, the HS rather than the TS, which was her competitor group to the London Lodge of the TS. And this is also the point where Blavatsky is now moved from India and is moved to, eventually winds up in London. So again, the Hermetic Society, or HS, is founded in 1885. Both Westcott and Mathers are active members of the Hermetic Society and give regular lectures on particularly the Kabbalah and the Sefer Yetzirah, which they're both researching in connection with the teachings of Anna Kingsford. In 1887, Mathers publishes the Kabbalah Unveiled, which is his translation of the Norvan Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denunata, some of the texts in that, which are ultimately derived from the Zohar. the Kabbalah Unveiled is dedicated to Anna Kingsford, who is at this time his magical teacher. 1887 is also the year when Westcott is starting to mention or talk about that there's this cipher manuscript that he's allegedly gotten from somewhere, although the story of how he got it is different at different times. He's not completely consistent about where this comes from. And this is also when the Anna Sprengel correspondence is forged by Westcott. And in my opinion, I think that the Golden Dawn cipher manuscript is also just forged basically at the same time. It might have been some papers that were part of this guy Kenneth Mackenzie, who was part of the was a Masonic friend of Westcott and Mathers, but in my opinion, I think it's just forged along with the. In other words, I don't think that the cipher manuscript that has outlines of the Golden Dawn rituals comes first, and then the Golden Dawn rituals are developed from that. I think that Mathers and Westcott collaborated together, developed the Golden Dawn rituals, and then the cipher manuscript was retroactively written to then reflect those rituals that they had written. So I think the rituals come first, and then the cipher manuscript follows that as a forgery to sort of provide a cover story or myth of origins to help promote the teachings of the order, which are in fact a form of Hermetic magic that's basically based on the teachings of the Hermetic Society, the particular confluence or combination of ideas and methods. And then 1888 is an important year. Anna Kingsford dies. She was consumptive. She passes away of tuberculosis. And this is part of the reason that she's not as well known. She dies rather young, and she had the potential to be a more prominent leadership figure moving forward, but there's just kind of these few years where she has the Hermetic Society, you kind of had to be there to be part of it. And so then after she dies, the Hermetic Society is closed, and then the Golden Dawn, which is founded by followers of hers, becomes the major Hermetic group that's in friendly competition, let's say, with the Theosophical Society. 1888 is also the year that the Golden Dawn is founded. Isis Urania Lodge, or Temple rather, is set up as the headquarters of the order in London. And by the end of the year, the Golden Dawn has initiated about 50 members, and then continues to grow from there. This is also the year 1888 that Blavatsky, who's now in London, she publishes The Secret Doctrine, her major late work. And she also founds the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, which is, again, promotes the idea that a certain type of practical occultism is going to be taught here and is in competition with the Golden Dawn, because the Golden Dawn is actively promoting that it's going to teach practical occultism. Sometimes it's said that the Golden Dawn was founded to compete with the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society, but actually there's good reason to suppose that it was actually the reverse was the case, that the Golden Dawn was founded as a successor group to the Hermetic Society to teach practical occultism. Then Blavatsky doesn't want to get left out of that because she wants to be the primary occult teacher in England. And so she founds the esoteric section to keep people from leaving the TS to go in and join the Golden Dawn. Oh, and by the way, in 1888, this is also the period when the Jack the Ripper murders are occurring in London, and everybody's really terrified about that as well. So 1888 is kind of an important year in occultism and in the late Victorian period. So the issue here, and that's at stake, and is the major contribution to the Golden Dawn in terms of its intervention to the larger milieu at this time, is that the Golden Dawn is teaching a system of what was called practical occultism. And in other words, there's all these occult teachers like Blavatsky and so forth, and they've got their visionary experiences or their esoteric teachings, but there's no, you can be one of their disciples, but there's no real information available in terms of how you yourself can become one of these adepts, how you yourself can spiritually develop yourself in order to actually practice the method of these particular these powers. And so there's all these magical powers that people are alleging to have, but there's been no methodology presented in terms of how practitioners might be able to develop these powers themselves. And so one of the difficulties about the Theosophical Society is that they're presenting these teachings of the Mahatmas, but the Mahatmas are off stage. And there's certain members of the leadership of the Theosophical Society that are claiming to have contact or access to these figures, but you have to go through them. And practical occultism is not taught in the Theosophical Society. And the reason given for that is that Blavatsky says it's too dangerous to teach to people. Only the higher initiates are allowed to have access to this. And so she starts the esoteric section, and so it's alleged that this is where you can learn practical occultism. But then when you actually show up to, it's an invitation-only group, but when you actually petition to get membership and you get in, it turns out that it's Blavatsky, again, just basically working through her book, The Secret Doctrine, and teaching about the sevenfold correspondence system that she has. And so it's just further elaboration of the same stuff. And again, there's no practical occultism that's being taught. This continues to be an issue in later iterations of theosophically derived traditions. So for example, Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophical Society, for example, which is a successor group to the TS, they also have their own esoteric section and basically copy the structure of the Theosophical Society in many ways. And yet again, there's no real methodology to what the Anthroposophical Society amounts to is that it's mostly study groups to study Rudolf Steiner's writings, in which Steiner is the great adept who presents all the teachings, and then you just learn about them and you're sort of, again, you're piously impressed, or this gives you a kind of a worldview that is meaningful to you or whatever, but there's no expectation that you're going to replicate his visions or get this information yourself, or there's some idea that this might happen, but politically it's not really acceptable to do this, or it just winds up that there's no practical methodology to actually do it yourself. And this is the big breakthrough with the Golden Dawn, which is that they've actually got a system of magic that you can learn. And of course, it's based on all the earlier bits and pieces of stuff that is in all the earlier stuff that we've already looked at in other classes during these courses. But what's so wonderful about the Golden Dawn is the synthesis. It's the way that it's all pulled together. So Swedenborg and Anna Kingsford have this idea that there's spiritual correspondences that you can use to interpret your visions. But it's in the Golden Dawn where this is really explicitly codified in a way where you actually have all the lists that you can use to, and this is what is eventually reproduced by Crowley in 777, the tables of correspondence, where all the practitioners in the system can have a common system of correspondences that they can all use together to more or less be on the same page when they're undertaking their astral voyages and seeing what Gnostic information that they can ferret out. And so you can compare notes with other practitioners because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you're having a vision, because you've got this already existing kind of alphabet of occultism, the tables of correspondence, which are finally kind of more or less coherently fully codified in the Golden Dawn, that then everybody after that can then, and is connected up with tarot cards, which come by way of Eliphas Levi's speculations with that, but it's been rectified so that the system is more coherent. And anyway, it all fits together. And the basis for this is, of course, the Kabbalistic tree of life, as like Crowley compares it to like a filing system, a series of drawers and folders where any possible idea can be cataloged and then compared to other ideas based on a coherent and self-consistent magical language. And so this is the big breakthrough. The Golden Dawn supplies its initiates with a complete and coherent system of ceremonial magic. This was mostly taught in the original iteration of the order in the inner or second order, which is called the Rosea Rubeae et Aurorae Crucis, the Red Rose and Gold Cross, or just the RRAC. And this is associated with the Rosicrucian order of the manifestos. And so there's the outer and the inner order of the Golden Dawn. The outer order is called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and it's the grades that run from Malkut up the tree to the portal that precedes the entry into Tifereth. And then the portal grade is technically a second order grade, but it's a preparatory entry grade. And then in the 5=6 initiation, that corresponds to Tifereth, which is a whole dramatic presentation of the myth of the Fama Fraternitatis, where there's a physical vault, and you go inside the vault and you're initiated as a Rosicrucian adept within the vault of Christian Rosenkreuz. And this was founded in 1891, was when the second order or inner order within the Golden Dawn was founded. And this was mostly based, it was founded and led mostly by Mathers. And then the way that it's structured is that the outer order is a kind of pedagogy. It's a kind of Hermetic study group, where by going through the different grades, you learn all the correspondences, system of correspondences, and the set of Kabbalistic and other historical Hermetic and occult ideas that then give you the body of information that you need. So then when you arrive in the inner order, and then you're ready to practice magic because you've got all the information that you need. And the outer order was not intended to take a long time to go through in the original Golden Dawn. Most people could proceed through it in about a year. And the initiations were not meant to be delayed significantly one after another. You wouldn't remain in a particular grade for several years. You would just, you take your neophyte, and then you take the Zealot initiation, and then the Theoricus, and then the Practicus and Philosophus, and then the Portal, and you'd have certain assignments that you'd be given, and you'd be given these knowledge lectures that again include the Hermetic study group material, basically the information that gives you all the Kabbalistic correspondences and how they relate to each other and what it means. And then you take a written test about each of those where you memorize basically just a few pages of material, and then you just advance to the next grade. And the point is not to hold people back. The point is to advance people through that material so that they get the information, and so then they can join the second order and then be practicing magic. And so this again is another important aspect of the original Golden Dawn, which is it functions as this pedagogical structure. And there's a sense in which William Wynne Westcott in particular originally conceived of the Golden Dawn as, again, I'm calling it this Hermetic study group, but that you would have ritual initiations and ritual magic and activity that were going on in it. And the outer order grade system and the basically Freemasonic structure of the ritual magic that is practiced in the Golden Dawn is derived from another organization that Mathers and Westcott were part of, which was called the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. In other words, the Rosicrucian Society in England, otherwise abbreviated the SRIA, which is basically a kind of, it's a club, like all Masonic groups are. It's a club for Master Masons to study esoteric Freemasonry. But it's mostly a club and study group, and so it's not a group that itself practices ritual magic. And it has, I think, some initiations, but they're relatively limited. They're not as elaborate as the ones that are in the Golden Dawn. But they do have this Sephirotic-based grade system, which is ultimately derived from an 18th century paramasonic alchemical order in Germany called the Golden Rosenkreuzer. So the Sephirotic associations and the names of the grades, the Neophyte, Zealot, Theoricus, Practicus, and Philosophus, those five Rosicrucian grades, derived from this 18th century group, the Golden Rosenkreuzer. Then they're incorporated into the system of the SRIA, and then Mathers and Westcott then use that as the format to then write the rituals for the Golden Dawn. And then Westcott, who's the kind of main primary initiator of that system, he conceives of this as a way to have a Hermetic study group to then equip people to practice ceremonial magic, Hermetic magic, and mysticism. And then Mather's contribution is the second order and although he did also collaborate with the first order, but particularly the 5=6 ritual and teachings are primarily written and put together by MacGregor Mathers. So again, the main point here is that unlike the SRIA, which like most Masonic bodies is said to be speculative, the Golden Dawn is operative, magical Freemasonry. And so it puts the batteries back in the machine, and you're actually doing magical rituals and intending them to be that, rather than doing club initiations that are like magical rituals, which is an important distinction. So Aleister Crowley is initiated into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in November 26th, 1898, and rapidly advances, as anybody who was interested to do so was able to do, through the outer order. But he's also become friends with Alan Bennett, who was closely associated with MacGregor Mathers, was basically Mathers' personal student. And so Crowley then becomes Alan Bennett's magical student. So Crowley is then the direct magical student of Alan Bennett, who's the direct magical student of Mathers. And even though technically he's not a second order initiate yet, Crowley and Bennett are, Bennett gives Crowley access to all the second order material, and they're studying it together at Crowley's flat in London. And so already before his second order initiation, Crowley has already learned all of this material. In 1900, from February to April, is what's called the Revolt of the Adepti, and is the breakup and end of the Golden Dawn. It's less important, I think, to go over the blow by blow of this particular falling out that occurs. Basically, the high points are April 17 and 19 is what's called the Battle of Blythe Road, where Crowley is appointed Mathers' representative and basically attempts to make an end run around the London Adepti by seizing control of the second order vault that's is in Blythe Road in London. When I was in London, I actually went by the building that is still the location. It's still there, the building where the second order vault was. It's just a regular tenement building with a store downstairs, and then there's rooms upstairs. And it's the second order vault was located in one of these upstairs apartments in this otherwise normal tenement building. And then in April 21st, the London Adepti expel Mathers from the order. And this is the end of the original Golden Dawn. And it's splintered. There's various magical organizations that continue and still continue today, but there's a schism, and they separate into different lineages and traditions. At this point, for example, Mathers has his own temple, Ahathor Temple in Paris. And so that continues under his leadership. And then the London Temple also continues, although they changed the name, and it's no longer the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And there's several different names that they have for the group. Eventually, it's called the Stella Matutina, and that group continues into the 1930s. But then by the Second World War has basically become moribund and ceased to exist. And then after the war, Israel Regardie publishes the Golden Dawn teachings, which were previously published by Crowley in the Equinox. And then there's a revival of interest in the Golden Dawn. Various new versions of the order are founded, and so on and so forth. And so there's various currently existing lineages of the Golden Dawn that continue to derive either from one or both of the two main schism groups, either the people that continued under Mathers' leadership and then eventually Moina Mathers, which includes Paul Foster Case or Dion Fortune, who received their initiations from that branch of the order, or there's the Stella Matutina, which Israel Regardie was initiated into in the 30s, and then there's this guy Robert Felkin, who was a leader in the Stella Matutina. He eventually emigrates to New Zealand and starts a temple there. And then there's an important branch of the order that derives also from New Zealand, which includes the writings by the Zalewskis, for example. And there's some other people that are associated with that particular branch. So anyway, that's the history of the order. And I think the important lesson from the breakup of the Golden Dawn is that because there was too much focus on the myth of origins, on the alleged existence or non-existence of the secret chiefs, that people got politically distracted from what was really supposed to be the focus of the order's work, which was achieving the gnosis of the personal divine genius and achieving personal spiritual illumination and gnosis, and that the order would then be a context where people who were seeking that attainment or who had attained aspects of that attainment could then have a place that they could cooperate with each other for larger cultural or social purposes. There's lots of artists, for example, who were involved in the Golden Dawn. William Butler Yeats, for example, was an important poet, and he more or less explicitly used ceremonial magic as a way to develop poetic inspiration, which is, of course, is something that Crowley also uses it for. So you can use magic for that, those kinds of cultural purposes. There's, of course, other things that you can use it for, but the ideal is that you could get people together to cooperate, and it didn't have to be just people off on their own in isolation, having to reinvent the wheel, rediscover the esoteric gnosis, and then more or less start from scratch to reform a group of disciples around them. And then the founding adept passes away, and then the disciples don't know how to become adepts themselves, and so it doesn't continue. And so then somebody else again has to come along and figure out again how to do it from scratch. Now that you've got the Golden Dawn system, or its various successors, including the AA pedagogy that Crowley has in his writings, it's no longer, one way to look at that is that it's no longer necessary to have to reinvent the wheel. That if you're coming along to get involved in magic, you've got these techniques and methodology already laid out that you can tap into and then develop your own approach to. And then you don't have to start from nowhere anymore. And so this is a significant advantage that the particular phase of the journey that we're in allows us to draw upon that earlier historical heritage where the magic and mysticism of antiquity has, as it were, already gone through the process of being adapted to modernity. And then all we have to then do is look back on that, recollect or re-engage with that body of lore and teaching and technique, and then through our own experimentation and involvement, further adapt that to our own particular unique circumstances, and also to the ways that modernity has continued to evolve from the Victorian and modernist period, where there's we no longer also live in that culture, so there's further adaptation that is then our role to facilitate. Anyway, we're coming up on about 3 o'clock, and I've covered most of the high points about the system. There's a great deal we could talk about the actual content of the Golden Dawn system itself. What I'd like to do at this point is to open to questions and comments and see what you folks would like to talk about. We can spend the last half hour discussing whatever topics about the Golden Dawn, which I'm assuming that most of us here are already at least broadly familiar with it. Let's see if we can get a conversation going about that. So Luke, go ahead. Or whoever wants to unmute their mic, go ahead and ask a question or make a comment or anything we want to maybe talk about.
Okay, my question is about the correspondences, and basically, I know the idea of them were kind of based off of Swedenborg's, and then kind of did Westcott and Mathers develop them after that, like through personal scrying, or was it based off of the Sefer Yetzirah, or just kind of a combination of everything to where they drew them all together and then listed them?
Yes, you've got the primary text right there is the Sefer Yetzirah, is the one that lays out the system of the 10 Sefirot, and then there's the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And that gives what Crowley calls the key scale that runs from 0 or 1 to 32 along the side of the columns that are in 777. And that gives you the basic categories. And then all the different things, colors, types of incense, magical tools or implements, types of animals, whatever you like, can then be associated with each of those particular categories. And of course, the really great advantage of that, having that particular map on, and that's derived with the Sefer Yetzirah as the sort of original text for that, is that then directly is able to be related to the tarot deck. And so then the tarot deck, this was Eliphas Levi's idea, but it's further developed by the Golden Dawn founders. This then gives you little symbolic images for each of that you can use to seed your meditation, that are then associated with all of these different 32 divine categories. And then you're able to invoke or banish basically any energy or force or idea in your magical practice. And it's this wonderfully flexible, but also complex and sophisticated system of relating ideas. It's really one of the most powerful contributions to the Western magical system. And although the idea of correspondences is, I mean, there's earlier versions of this. So, for example, the alchemists in ancient Burma have this idea of what they call the signatures of all things. That so, for example, if you're practicing plant alchemy, um, different types of plants would be associated with different like planets or astrological signs. And then you could, and then certain diseases would be healed by um, the medicinal quality of stuff that would then be categorized in these different varieties. And it was thought that the plants or metals that had these planetary or zodiacal correlations would receive through a kind of like cosmic effluvium, that there would be a kind of spiritual influence operating through the world soul, whereby um, these plants or metals or talismans that you would make would receive magical energy, as it were, or power or influence through the cosmos that could then affect different thaumaturgical effects. And so basically what Swedenborg does is he makes this more semiotic. It becomes more grammatical. It's based on the particular correspondences are now not so much understood as being effects of natural magic occurring through astrological effects, but they're the effect of language itself becomes a collection of magical symbols. These are signs or signifiers that, in their very status of being signs or signifiers, have a sacred or holy significance that the adept is initiated into, has gnosis or knowledge or understanding of how to manipulate. And then your visions can then be, or if you're reading scripture, for example, you can then see how these signs or signifiers appear. And then and there's a connection with this to the earlier form of natural magic, because there's the idea that there's a kind of parallelism between, I'm going to use some traditional Christian theological language here, that there's a parallel or analogy that's supposed to exist between the book, what's called the book of scripture on one hand, and the book of nature on the other. And the idea is that by reading either, you're supposed to see the signs or indications of God's activity, and you can learn about salvation from either the book of scripture, but then there's this idea that you can also see the providence of God in the book of nature, if you know how to read it, as it were. And so what Swedenborg does is he kind of, in his usual kind of crazy wise way, kind of conflates these together, so that scripture now gives you you're no longer supposed to interpret the Bible literally, but now it provides you with all these mystical symbols that then you can, are signs or signifiers that can then signify to you when you encounter them elsewhere, either in the world or in your imagination, which is also heaven, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, anybody can then come along and practice so-called astral projection, what Carl Jung calls the active imagination. And then you can see, again, all these signs or signifiers can then appear, and then these become more or less codified or cataloged by the Eliphas Levi has this idea, oh, there's the Sefer Yetzer that says there's 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Well, those would be like the holy signs or signifiers that are like in Swedenborg's correspondences. But hey, there's also 22 trumps of the tarot deck. What if those correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet? And then according to the Sefer Yetzirah, the 22 letters correspond either to the 12 signs of the zodiac or the 7 planets, or what are called the 3 mother letters, which are fire, air, and water, which are 3 elements which are understood to combine together to then form the 4th element of earth. And then there's also, you could interpret an element of spirit that would then also be the totality of those, or the essence then of those four elements, perhaps. Anyway, that's the Golden Dawn's interpretation, the Sefer Yetzirah. So you can take that scale of 22 and break it up into what were originally these astrological correspondences, but now they signify to the letters, which can then make words, or words can then be reduced to letters, which can also be these images from the tarot deck. And so you've got all these resources then to work with. And then you've got the 10 Sephirot, which then replicate that system, but in a different order, which then is a path working that you can ascend back up to the divine by climbing up the tree. And so it has all of these, and you can then do path workings on the tree where you can astrally project yourself into the various signs. So what Crowley does is he'll often what he would do when he was training his students in astral projection, what he would do is he would hold up a particular tarot card and have them look at that. And then he would have them close their eyes and imagine that there was a doorway in front of them that the tarot card was on. And then they would pass through that and have a vision. You would have them narrate that vision. And that would be how you'd astrally project. Slightly different technique. There's another slightly different, but compatible technique that's given in Liber O for astral projection. These are all different ways to relate to the symbol system that's provided by the Golden Dawn's Kabbalistic codification of these systems of correspondences. So hopefully that answers your question in terms of what the genealogy is of these different ideas, how these things connect together.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. And by the way, the class has been great and really appreciated it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Please feel welcome to ask questions about things that are unclear or you want more elaboration on. We've got a few minutes left to cover a few things, and this is the last class where everything kind of comes together. So if anybody has any questions, for example, about how stuff earlier with some of the earlier classes relates to this, you could ask that too. So we were just, for example, talking about how the Sefer Yetzirah, which is a text from late antiquity, relates to this as well. So all this is synthetic. And again, that's what's so wonderful about the Golden Dawn and about the Thelemic tradition as well, is that it draws from all this rich earlier material and is kind of synthesizing it in this intelligent way. Rex or Luke, did you have any questions or comments, things we might want to talk about in the last 20 minutes or so?
Thanks. No questions really, but I just want to make a comment and say I've really enjoyed your series.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Luke, go ahead.
Yeah, same here. Really enjoyed it. And I really love how it just kind of brings together all these different historical significances and reflects them into kind of like a whole. So I was just kind of looking at some of the earlier, like the Lurian
the Lurianic material. Yeah.
Lurianic, like how far that like changed and kind of got like partly subsumed or like turned into like what's now the modern Kabbalah, and like how it's very different but still has the same like origin kind of.
Sure. Thank you for mentioning the Lurianic material. And that allows me to segue to maybe a good thing to finish by talking about, which is that one of the things that's under debate in the modern reiterations of esotericism is what's the interpretive horizon, or sort of basic theoretical ultimate import of these systems. What's the absolute, or the ultimate theme or idea that is then going to organize this material. And particularly given that as a kind of subtext of the development of Western esotericism and modernity, there's a successive moving away from monotheistic theism, for example, which was the basis for mysticism in the three main monotheistic traditions that are operative in a kind of again Western macro scale environment in the medieval period. And so those would be the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions, which are all monotheistic and which all had a version of esotericism. For Christianity, that's mysticism, which is usually based on a kind of Neoplatonism, and derives either from usually St. Augustine or from Pseudo-Dionysus, usually practiced by monastic professionals, but there's also a popular kind of what's called pietism, and there's frequent revivals of this in medieval times by lay people as well. There's texts like the Cloud of Unknowing that's associated with that, where there's a kind of negative theology where you ascend to the hidden God through a kind of contemplative quietism. And then there's Sufism in Islam and the Kabbalistic tradition of esoteric speculation in Judaism. And we talked a little bit about how the Lurianic tradition already represents a kind of modernization of Kabbalah within an intra-Jewish dialogue or discourse. What's important about that is that when you get to the Golden Dawn, superficially at least, the Kabbalah that's being presented in the Golden Dawn appears to be mostly based on the Zohar, which is a medieval version of the Kabbalah. But as I showed earlier, particularly in the doctrine concerning the kings of Edom, and there's a few other points in the Golden Dawn teachings, there is what appears to be this Lurianic element, which is a post-medieval, early modern kind of rethinking of the medieval Kabbalah in terms of the idea of what Lurie calls the Tzimtzum, the idea that there's this primordial negation, or there's an activity of negation that occurs within the Godhead itself. In other words, there's a sense in which God itself, rather than being understood as some kind of metaphysical positivity beyond time and space, is to be understood instead as a kind of negativity. And this is important because it leads MacGregor Mathers to speculate in his introduction to the Kabbalah Unveiled into a category of what he calls negative existence. And so he characterizes the Sephirotic structure of the Tree of Life as being this Platonic emanational scheme, which then ends in the material world in Malkut at the bottom of the tree. But then there's this anterior structure, what he calls the three veils of negative existence, Ein Sof, Or, that are three veils that lie above Kether. And so there's some speculation with regards to that in Mathers. Now, this is still Platonic. This is still, in other words, this is a domain of what is in itself a positive metaphysical absolute being, but that only appears to be negative from the point of view of the emanations that proceed from it. But there is nevertheless this kind of idea of a kind of innate negativity to ultimate being that then is the basis for then the positive emanation of the tree. And this comes from the Lurianic tradition. Aleister Crowley further radicalizes this concept of negative existence in Mathers. And he does this by, I think, making the correct philosophical critique of it, where he says that to talk about negative existence is a contradiction, and that Crowley then, influenced by the Buddhist concept of nothingness or shunyata, comes to the realization that he re-stumbles upon the insight of the Lurianic tradition. And he does this in his essay Barashith, an essay in ontology, where he says, I assert the absoluteness of the Kabbalistic zero, Kabbalistic nothingness, the levels that lie before Kether, but I interpret these, he says that when the Kabbalists talk about the absolute being nothing, I interpret them as actually meaning nothingness, not a kind of positivity that's just called nothingness, which is Mather's Platonic interpretation. And so what's so radical and important about that is that through the kind of mediation of Buddhism as kind of the interlocutor, but also Lurianic Kabbalah, these two radical traditions, there's a break with Neoplatonism being the basis for the Western esoteric tradition, which is usually presumed in the Hermetic tradition, because the Hermetic tradition is derived from the Corpus Hermeticum, which are what you could call Middle Platonic texts. They're not quite the version of Platonism that develops at the end of the Roman Empire with the Iamblichus, but they're a version of Platonism that's part of the genealogy of the development of Plato's philosophy that leads into that. So there's the idea that there's a kind of pleroma or fullness of being beyond space and time that has this absolute quality that this universe is then just a fallen off inferior emanation of. And basically what Crowley is doing with his formulation of, and that then metaphysical one that precedes reality in Platonism is then a kind of cryptotheistic concept. So it's not, in Platonism, it's not quite immediately identifiable with the monotheistic God of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, although the Platonic versions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism will identify the Platonic one with their more literary monotheistic God that appears in the Torah tradition, in the Bible, and is the speaker of the Quran, for example. But you could say then that in Platonism, you could have either the absolute is either a personal or an impersonal God. And what Crowley is doing is he's making, he's basically making an atheist critique of that. And he's following both Buddhism, which is basically an atheist tradition, but also a kind of post-exilic Jewish tradition, which treats God as a kind of absence. God has disappeared at the beginning of either at the beginning of time, or at the destruction of the temple, to result in the Jewish community being in exile. And so God is known through Torah observance in the world. There's a kind of trace of the divine, but the divine fullness in a Platonic sense is missing in action. It's not there anymore. And so there's a kind of radical severance from that. And then holiness and sanctity is what's created through mitzvot or ritual observance, basically ritual magic, where human beings and their community with each other is then the locus of how the sacred is brought back into the world that is in exile from God. And then the third radical element is then Blavatsky herself, who, in a letter that I read in the last week's class, says that she's a Buddhist, and so her concept of the absolute is a kind of transcendent nothingness that is neither a personal nor an impersonal God. And so Crowley's concept of the Kabbalistic zero is in accord with that concept of the absolute. And so it's a further radicalization of the Lurianic tradition to posit what he calls not the Buddhist nothingness, but the Kabbalistic nothingness. And then that relates to a theurgic magical tradition, which, like Jewish mitzvot or observance, is a way for magic with a K to then serve as this place where human beings are then, we're the location of the divine, not in some other world. The divine is not located in some other dimension. It's us, our unique existence. The Hadith spark of the divine is each one of ours unique existing in time and space within the world that is then potentially the site or the locus of the divine that we're able to sacralize through ritual practice, through magic. And so then we're the gods. And so we're no longer as Thelemites worshiping the divine as an external divinity that's in some other world that we have to be saved by. We're then responsible for achieving our own, as the Buddha says, work out your own salvation with diligence. That's the Thelemic ideal, that's what we're doing through magical practice. And we're not sitting around waiting to be saved by having faith in some God that's in another world that we can't reach. There is no other world. This is it. This is the reality that we're in. That is all the planes and magical adventures that we can have are right here in our own divine imagination, and the potentially sacralized social dimension of the cooperative relationships we can have with other human beings, where the ecstatic adventure that we can have in love and ecstasy are part of that. All dimensions of our own self-gnosis. And so this is all coded into Crowley's radical, again, further reinterpretation of the Western esoteric tradition, which then involves a kind of break with Platonism, which has to occur because Platonism is tied up with the organic, hierarchical, metaphysical, otherworldly worldview of the medieval world, and that world has been supplanted by modernity. And so it's all had to be updated. We've gone through several stages of that, and then Thelema is the current updated, for us at least, phase of that. But it has to go through all these critical stages where it's both bringing forward stuff from the past, but also reevaluating it. And so Platonism is ultimately a dualistic, otherworldly tradition, which is then aligned with the otherworldly ascetic agenda of the monotheistic traditions, which are the slavish and enslaving traditions of colonialism and of the oppressive medieval church that we're trying to overthrow and move beyond that kind of limited spirituality in our own contemporary experience. Anyway, that's my spiel about the Kabbalistic zero and how that then is introduced into it's like the last move that gets made in the reevaluation of these traditions. Any other questions or comments? We're now moving towards the end of the class and the course. Anything else anybody else wants to say?
I did think of one question, Nathan,
Yes.
that I had. At the beginning of your talk today, you talked about the connection between Anna Kingsford and Anna Springle.
Yes.
Is there more to be said about that? That, to me, that was a new idea, and I hadn't realized that they were connected before. Is there anything more, or is there any documentation to follow up on that?
No, it's just my own speculation based on the obvious fact that all serious Golden Dawn scholars acknowledge that the Anna Sprangle correspondence is a forgery.
Sure.
And so then the question is why? What's the motivation? Why is this being done? And so my speculation is based on kind of the similar question of why Blavatsky was doing this, because the founders of the Golden Dawn are copying Blavatsky by having this cover story. So then the question is, well, maybe, I'm speculating, the reasoning behind that is similar to the reasoning as to why Blavatsky felt it was necessary to cover her tracks, as it were. And it's common at this time for people who are promoting themselves as occult teachers to not necessarily reveal the identity of their teachers, because they all have them. It's just this is part of the this is what's occult, what's hidden, right? So Rudolf Steiner says that he had a particular teacher when he was studying like plant biology. This was like a breakthrough point because he learned how to describe like etheric bodies of plants at one point. And this was how he understood. So he had a kind of alchemical teacher at one point, who presumably is an actual person who like was some kind of homeopathic you know, doctor or whatever who Steiner, you know, studied with, but he never gave away what the identity of this person was, never said what their name was. So we don't know who this person was, but we know that he had this teacher because in his autobiography, he refers to this, and this was apparently an important teacher of his. And so many of these, and of course, it gives you a kind of, it's an example maybe of what, also what the literary critic Harold Bloom calls the anxiety of influence. And what this is when somebody comes along who's a strong creator, either in a literary or scientific or some other field of endeavor, they're a strongly creative person. They want to be seen as coming up with their own ideas about how everything works, their own theory. But all theories and ideas that people come up with are based and inspired by either carrying forward or reinterpreting earlier theories or ideas that other people before them had. And so what Harold Bloom is pointing out is that it's a common technique in literature or elsewhere for people who are coming forward with their own work to more or less conceal the influence that preceded them. And this can be done more or less honestly, depending on who the person is. And so there's a similar motif at work with esotericism where particular occult teachers, in order to promote their own agenda themselves as the source of the teaching, will undervalue or conceal or obfuscate what the actual historical sources were for the teachings that they're presenting. And so in the case I'm proposing of Mathers and Westcott, the person that I think was their primary magical teacher, which is Anna Kingsford, they concealed her identity under this cover story of this other Anna Sprangel, as the person who was then going to be the source of the teachings of the Golden Dawn. And what I think is funny about that is that anybody who actually cares to look at the historical record can see that Mathers and Westcott were part of the Hermetic Society just before they founded the Golden Dawn, where they were studying under this woman, Anna Kingsford. And gosh golly, if you look at her work, it's awfully similar to the kind of teaching that was being taught in the Golden Dawn. And so actually there's no mystery here where the teaching emerges from. And it's just that everybody gets confused because there's this cover story that then people think should be interpreted literally, and then they get upset if it's not true, and they're missing what the actual genealogy was. They're missing, which is available for anybody to look at. It's not really hidden at all. It's just you have to know how to look. And I guess the lesson from that is that when we talk about esotericism, we don't mean that the information in question is actually unavailable. It is available, and it's always been historically available. You just have to know to look for it. And this is how magic is ultimately what I call hermeneutical or interpretive. You have to ask the right questions. And if you ask the right questions, the information that you need will appear as that which is relevant to you, and then you're able to use it to then get to the answers that you're looking for. But you have to start with the right questions. And if you start with the wrong questions, you'll be led in the wrong direction. And so for me, that's kind of the key for understanding the history of magic and occultism, is to know what are the right questions to ask. And if you're asking the wrong questions, which is, you know, where's the hidden Mahatma that I can get in telepathic communication with, you'll miss the fact that this is what's called a blind. This is a cover story for some other relationship to some personal information that all you have to do is kind of pivot and look, and you'll be able to get access to that and be able to proceed and not be stuck in confusion or doubt or uncertainty as to what's going on. So I don't know if that answers your.
No, it does. It totally does. Thank you. That's brilliant.
And this to me is the key to understanding the Western esoteric tradition, is to not have the wrong assumptions in terms of what you're looking for. And then, but then if if you do find the right track, that it's all going to be illuminative. It's all going to be this really useful stuff that goes back literally thousands of years, where there's gold all over the place that's usable for us. All these texts and traditions that just pure, wonderful stuff that's great to be able to get access to. It's just you have to have the right interpretive relationship to it so that you know how to read it, and then it signifies. And then we're in this active conversation with magical adepts from thousands of years ago. And it's like a living conversation that we're still part of. Anyway, that's going to be it for the class. It's 3:30. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this. And we'll do some more classes, but we haven't figured out what those are going to be. In the meantime, we've got about 24 hours of material here about the Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. So love is the law, love it or will. Taryn, if you hit the end for the